My aunt said, "You'll never win against me." After stealing my share. So I waited until she was out of town, bought her house at auction, and had it demolished. I'd always been the kind of person who believed family mattered more than anything. My mom, Leona, had drilled that into me growing up, always talking about loyalty and how, no matter what, you don't turn your back on family. So when she passed away suddenly 5 years ago, I clung to the little family I had left. My dad had never been in the picture, and besides some distant cousins I barely knew, it was really just me and Aunt Margaret. Now, Margaret had always been a larger-than-life character. She was the oldest of my mom's siblings, and she loved that position. She was married to Roger Hastings, a self-made real estate guy who'd done quite well for himself, though rumor had it that his wealth came with a few shady deals on the side. Together, Margaret and Roger had lived in a massive house just outside town, with pillars on either side of the entrance like some southern estate. I'll never forget the day Margaret came over to help me with my mom's estate. I barely had time to process my grief, and there she was in my living room, her manicured nails tapping the edge of her handbag, a tight smile on her face. "Oh, Henry, honey, I know this is hard," she said, patting my shoulder in a way that felt like a consolation prize. "But you don't have to go through this alone." Her eyes scanned the room, no doubt taking in the worn furniture, the clutter from my mom's life that was still scattered everywhere. She always had this way of making me feel like a kid, like my whole life was on display for her critique. "Thanks, Aunt Margaret," I said, managing a small smile. "I appreciate it." "Well, you know, I've been handling family matters for decades now," she continued, voice dripping with that polished charm of hers. "When Mom and Dad passed, I was the one who stepped up, and Roger and I have resources." I felt her point coming like a freight train. "So, what are you saying?" "Oh, I'm just saying," she said with a little shrug, "you have a lot on your plate, and I'd hate for you to make any regrettable mistakes. I know how to navigate the estate stuff. You don't have to stress about a thing." At the time, I was still so raw from losing Mom that I almost felt grateful. She sounded sincere, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she really was trying to help. So I let her handle it. I signed a few papers she brought over, barely reading them. She called it standard paperwork. Who was I to question? I had no idea that by signing those forms, I was basically giving her control over most of my mother's assets, including the family cabin upstate. It wasn't until 3 months later, as I was sorting through Mom's old files, that I found the quitclaim deed to the cabin, signed over to Margaret Hastings. My heart dropped. That cabin was my mom's sanctuary, her retreat where she'd taken me every summer. I had memories in every corner of that place. Margaret knew how much it meant to me. My hands started shaking as I stared at that signature. My mom's name was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I didn't wait. I called her that very night. "Margaret," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, Did she sell the cabin to you?" There was a pause, followed by her lilting laugh, as if I'd asked her if the sky was green. "Oh, honey, that cabin was always going to be mine. Your mother promised it to me years ago. You know how close we were. She must have just forgotten to tell you." "I don't believe that," I said, my voice growing sharp. "She would have told me. That place was our spot." "Henry, don't be dramatic," she sighed. "Look, I know you're going through a lot, but your mother and I had an understanding. She wanted me to have that cabin." I wanted to scream at her, but I was too stunned to argue. "But the paperwork is perfectly legal," she cut in, her voice dropping to an icy tone I'd never heard from her before. "If you want to dispute it, you'll need to take it up with my lawyer. But Henry, don't waste your money. I have everything documented." The call ended with her telling me she was just trying to keep things simple, but I felt like I'd been robbed. And by family, no less. Months turned into years. I tried to contest the deed, but Margaret's lawyer was airtight. Every time I brought it up, she'd either brush me off or deliver some condescending comment, like, "You know, maybe if you'd spent more time handling things instead of working at that paper, this wouldn't have happened." Or, "It's just a cabin, Henry. Move on." But moving on wasn't so easy, especially when she started renting out the cabin as a luxury retreat. Seeing her advertise it online, bragging about our family's lakefront cabin, was like a punch to the gut every single time. And the kicker? She'd even decorated it with Mom's belongings, listing it as vintage decor for a nostalgic stay. I avoided family gatherings for a while. Whenever I saw her, the urge to confront her was too strong. But finally, 2 years later, I felt like I was getting back on my feet. I'd started dating Sarah, this incredible woman who was both patient and understanding. She'd hear me vent sometimes, but she never pressured me to confront Margaret. She knew it was a battle I wasn't ready for. Then, out of nowhere, one night, I got a call from Greg, an old friend who worked in real estate. "Henry, I didn't know if I should call you about this," he said, sounding unsure. "But I thought you might want to know." "Know what?" I asked, a bit thrown off by the tone in his voice. "It's Margaret's house. It's going up for auction next Tuesday." My jaw dropped. "What? How?" Apparently, Roger lost a ton of money on some investment. They couldn't keep up with payments. The bank took it over. They're keeping it quiet, but it's scheduled for public auction. I sat there, stunned, trying to process the fact that Margaret, the woman who had lorded over me for years, was about to lose her precious house. The irony was delicious, but it was also unnerving. I hadn't ever considered revenge, not seriously, but the opportunity was just sitting there, tempting me. I didn't tell Sarah at first. I needed to sit with it, to see if I'd actually go through with it. The idea kept gnawing at me. Margaret had stolen the cabin, taken what little I had left of my mother. And now, here was a chance to take something back. By Monday, I was resolved. I went to the bank, withdrew everything I'd saved, and stood at that auction the next day, my heart pounding as I watched the numbers climb. I kept bidding, my hand going up again and again, ignoring the stares from a few other people who probably thought I was nuts. But finally, I had it. Margaret's mansion, the crown jewel of her life, was mine. 2 days later, I got the call. Margaret, barely holding back rage, her voice strangled with disbelief. "Henry," she spat. "What have you done?" "Oh, hey, Margaret," I said, as casual as I could manage. "Nice to hear from you. What's the problem? Don't play games with me. You bought my house?" "My house?" "Was your house," I corrected, enjoying this more than I should have. "It was at auction. Anyone could have bought it." There was a furious silence on the other end, and I could practically hear her clenching her jaw. "You know what? You're making a huge mistake. I will fight you on this." "Oh, I know you will," I said, grinning. "Just like I fought you over the cabin?" There was a gasp, and then she was back, voice steely. "You'll regret this. Mark my words, Henry. You don't cross family like this and get away with it." I think we both know that door swung the other way first. With that, I hung up, my heart pounding, adrenaline surging like never before. I headed to the house that weekend, standing in front of the bulldozers I'd hired to tear down her precious mansion brick by brick. I watched as the bulldozers tore through the facade of Margaret's precious house, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't give me a thrill. This was her pride, the very symbol of her pillar of the family image. Every strike of the wrecking ball felt like a piece of her control over my life shattering to pieces. I thought back to every time she'd sneered at me, dismissed me, and waved off my pain like it was nothing. This was justice. 2 hours into the demolition, a sleek black car screeched into the driveway. Margaret burst out, wild-eyed, her usual polished demeanor shattered. She looked up at the ruin of her home, hands shaking, then whipped around to me standing off to the side, arms crossed, as I watched with satisfaction. "You!" she shrieked, storming over. "You had no right." I stayed calm, glancing back at the bulldozers as they rolled over her manicured front lawn. "Oh, but I did. I bought the property fair and square. Isn't that what you always told me? Legal matters are legal matters," she sputtered, face red with fury. "You're out of your mind, Henry. This is my home." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. I thought Roger owned it. Funny how things change when you're on the receiving end, isn't it? She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "Listen, we can talk about this," she said, dropping her tone to that familiar condescending drawl she used when she thought she could manipulate me. "You don't really want this, Henry. You're just upset. You can't possibly want to destroy family property." I laughed, loud and hard, catching her off guard. "Family property? Margaret, you took my family's property. That cabin meant the world to my mom and me, and you stole it. Don't talk to me about family property." She clenched her fists, her voice trembling with anger. "I had every right to that cabin. Your mother wanted me to have it." "No, she didn't," I replied coldly. "You took advantage of my grief, lied to me, and forged her signature. I was too broken to see it then, but not anymore." She threw her hands up, her voice cracking. "Fine. You got what you wanted. You took my house. Are you happy now, Henry? This is a disgrace. You're not just destroying a house. You're tearing apart this family's legacy." At that, I turned to face her fully. "The only thing tearing this family apart, Margaret, is you. For years, you manipulated and controlled everyone around you. You made me feel small, like I didn't deserve anything. But guess what? I'm done letting you do that. I'm reclaiming what's mine." Just then, one of the contractors approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Taylor? We're about to start on the second phase of the demo. Did you want anything salvaged?" I looked straight at Margaret, holding her gaze. "No. Take it all down. Every last brick." She let out a strangled gasp, grabbing my arm as if she could still stop this. "Henry, you're making a huge mistake. You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." I shook her hand off, my voice steady. "No, Margaret. The only regret I have is that I trusted you in the first place." With that, I walked away, leaving her to watch as the rest of her house crumbled to the ground. I didn't stay to see her reaction as the bulldozer tore into the foundation. I'd had my closure. The fallout from the demolition was swift. Margaret went to the rest of the family, spinning her tale of how I'd betrayed her, hoping to rally them against me. But here's the thing about people like Margaret, they eventually show their true colors. Turns out, she'd burned a lot of bridges over the years, and when they learned about her shady dealings with the cabin, most of the family had no sympathy left for her. Over the next few months, word spread around town about Margaret's fall from grace. She tried to cling to her old life, but with Roger's debts piling up and her reputation tarnished, they had to downsize to a small rental. The few times I ran into her, she'd give me this icy glare, like she was still plotting some way to get back at me, but I knew she had no cards left to play. One day, as I was going through some old boxes of my mom's, I found a letter from her that I'd somehow missed. It was dated a few months before she passed, and in it, she wrote about how she'd always wanted the cabin to go to me. She talked about how proud she was of the person I'd become, how she knew I'd keep the family legacy alive in my own way. Reading it felt like a final confirmation that I'd done the right thing. Sarah and I eventually bought a small plot of land by the lake, not far from where the old cabin stood. We built a cozy little house with big windows overlooking the water, a place that felt like home, not just some symbol of status. I took some of my mom's old furniture there, the pieces that mattered, and made sure they had a place in this new chapter of my life. Years later, I heard Margaret had moved to a tiny condo in Florida, far away from the life she once flaunted. I don't know if she ever thought about what she lost, but I know I did. She lost her family, her legacy, and the respect of everyone who once knew her, all because she couldn't see past her own greed. As for me, I'd finally let go of the bitterness. Building a life from the ground up was harder than tearing something down, but it was also more rewarding. I'd taken back what was stolen from me, not just in property, but in peace of mind. Every summer, when I sit on the deck of our lake house with Sarah and watch the sunset, I think of my mom. I know she'd be proud of how things turned out. Margaret may have thought she'd won back then, but in the end, I reclaimed more than just a piece of land. I reclaimed my family's legacy, my dignity, and my future. And that, to me, was worth every bit of the fight.